In today's video, we will try to understand the Azure Virtual Network traffic routing. So let's get started. Azure Virtual Network traffic routing. This is our topic for today, and it is really important to understand the fundamentals of routing in Azure Virtual Network. So to understand this, let's come to the absolutely basics. So let's suppose this is our virtual network, all right? Virtual network. Inside the virtual network, we have what? We have subnets. Let's call this is one subnet. This is another subnet, just to understand. Now, inside the subnets, we create VMs. VM is assigned to one of the subnet from where it will drive its private IP address. Okay, there is no public IP address attached, it's absolutely private. So this design or this diagram is, I believe, is absolutely clear, and it should be clear to understand the fundamentals of routing inside virtual network or in Azure Virtual Network or in Azure. Okay. Now, when you create a virtual network, you define subnets, you create multiple subnets. It may be a app subnet or it may be a DB subnet here. So we have multiple subnets for multiple workloads. And when we create by default, yes, by default, if this VM tries to talk to any other VM inside the virtual network, maybe in a different subnet, it can. Or maybe in a same subnet, it can talk to each other. For example, if this VM is inside the same subnet, then these two can also talk to each other like this. Even these can talk to each other without you defining anything, without you designing anything, adding anything. By default, it happens in Azure, right? And for example, you have created a VM. You might have tried this in your lab as well. You might have created this VM, let's suppose, and you try to access internet. You try to access internet, and you can by default access internet without designing or creating or deploying anything else. By default, you can access the internet as well, right? So how this is happening? Who is telling these VMs that you can talk to each other? You can talk to VM in a different subnet. How this is happening? This is what the traffic routing is. All these things are happening by default by system. Yes, because Azure automatically creates a route table for each subnet. Yes, what it creates something very important to know is route table. Route table is the magic behind this communication, which is created automatically by Azure. So what Azure does, Azure automatically creates route table. Azure automatically creates route table. Okay, for each subnet within Azure Virtual Network, and adds what it is adding: system default routes. These all are default routes. If you don't do anything, by default it is created. It is more or less like you are on cloud computing, you are on cloud creating something. You need not to go through the basic steps. If you only need to just do the lab, you just deploy the VM and you can do all the basic networking will be defined by the Azure itself. Until you want to override it, you can by defining custom routes. And when you define custom routes, you can override the default route, but you cannot see the default route table the way we create it, I'll show you in the lab. Okay, so to answer this question, how this is happening is system routes. Okay, system routes. It is created by Azure automatically. Now, let's suppose in the same scenario, this is about the one virtual network. You just created VM, VNet deployed automatically, or maybe you created VNet, subnet, and deployed virtual machine. And system created or Azure created system routes, system default routes automatically, so that you have this basic uh, traffic in place already. Now, what if you create one more virtual network? Okay, but if you create virtual network, maybe you're just trying to perform the lab that we talked about in the previous video. What was it? It was peering lab. So you have multiple subnet here as well. Okay, let's suppose the subnet 1 and you have subnet 2 here, and you also have a VM on these subnets, right? And you created something called peering. You created peering between these two virtual networks. Let's call it peering. Now, when we created the peering, we were not defining any routes again, which means this VM was able to talk to the VM on this side, and this side VM can also able to talk to VM on this virtual network without defining any route table, without defining any route, so called. So whatever you perform, the basic networking, Azure automatically picks those things and apply the system default routes. You need not to go ahead and do it. So this is what happens. You maybe if you deploy a gateway, VPN gateway, the system default route create one more route will be created, which talks about or which defines the network traffic of VPN gateway. Okay, so that's how it is happening here. Now let me show you the default routes in our portal. Okay, let me open the Azure portal for you. So this is Azure portal. If you go to any virtual machine, let's go to this virtual machine, and from where the traffic flows, it flows through NIC. So you need to go to NIC. Under NIC, if you go under help, you'll see effective routes. These are the routes created by the system. These are the effective routes, and all the default one are created by the system. Now it is loading right now. See, there we go. All these source default is created by the system. Now if you see this one, the first one is by default. All this is the CIDR range of our virtual network, if you remember in the previous video. So all the virtual machine can talk to each other. It is allowed. Okay, next hop is virtual network. We also did the peering. So that's why this is also created by the system, which means 10.1.0.0/16 VNet peering. So traffic, if one of the virtual machine try to go to this range, means a virtual network 2, then the traffic goes to the peering and they can talk to each other. If somebody try to access internet, it is allowed to go to the internet. Okay, that is the next hop type. These are the system default created, but that's that's the default one. But the real life is not that simple, like you created everything and it happens. But you want to control the traffic, you have to control the traffic. Okay, and to do that, there is something called, which is user defined route. Okay, user defined routes, and these are the routes which can override the system routes. Okay, When and where we need these user defined routes or custom routes, you can say, wherever we would like or we need to control the traffic. For example, let's take this scenario. I think we have already explained this in one of the video, but let me show you here. Let's suppose there is a hub vnet, there is a spoke vnet, there is this spoke vnet. Okay, just to understand, because we want the basics absolutely clear. Okay, spoke, and we have this is spoke vnet again. Now in the hub vnet we have things like firewall. Okay, this is our firewall, and here we have virtual machines. Okay, and also we have virtual machine here. Now because this is an enterprise, this is business and IT infrastructure, so we want to audit, we want to check, we want to control all the network traffic for the security reasons. So this VM, we don't want this VM to access internet just like that, the way it was happening in the uh, default route. When you access internet, if it is a system default route, you can, but this is not secure from the enterprise perspective, from the business perspective. So what we want, because there is a connectivity between these virtual network and it's a hub and spoke topology, we want all the traffic filtered, scanned through this firewall. Okay, only whatever is allowed should be allowed, otherwise it's not allowed. Now this guy sitting here try to access some application which is allowed, like my ms learn. It should go to here on the firewall, not on the internet by default. How this happens? Because we have applied UDRs. We have applied UDRs, user defined routes, which will simply say if you are accessing internet, you should go to firewall. Now in the firewall, filtration happen and it will allow or disallow as per the rules. For example, MS Learn is allowed, but Facebook is not, things like that. So how this traffic controlling is happening? It is happening through UDR, which is called user defined route. Let me show you how this works. In user defined routes, it's simple, nothing much. We have to create the route table first. Inside the route table, we create the routes, because that's how it is. All right, so let me create you the route table. Now let's suppose, if you remember, our VM was in West US, VMRG. Let me call it demo route table. Okay, nothing much is needed, because this is just a canvas, black canvas, on which we will paint the routes and associate those routes to the subnets. Okay, so let's create it. So what are we doing? We are just creating a route table in the same location where the VNet is, and inside this we will create routes. And how the route gets created, we have to define the destination. Okay, we have to define the next hop, and we'll see what all we need to define. So this route table is created. Under the route table, if you go settings, you'll find routes. We'll click on add inside the routes. Once you hit the add, we need to give it a name. Let's call it internet. Okay, that's fine. Destination type, let's call it IP address. Let's give this destination. If somebody tries to access internet, let's say this donates internet. Next hop is we want it to go through virtual appliance, which is our firewall. So we need to give the private IP address of our firewall. It could be in the hub as it was portraying in our design or in our diagram. 10.0.0 dot, let's call it 7. Okay, we need to add it. So once we create this, go to the diagram here. No, this one. Next hop. So what we did, we provided the route name. Okay, destination and next hop. Destination is internet. If somebody is trying to access internet, next hop is firewall or virtual appliance. This is what is happening. This VM trying to access internet, but the next hop is firewall. Instead of internet, the next hop is firewall. So this guy will go to the firewall. That's how it is created. Now let me go to the YouTube here. So this route is created. Now what we need to do, we need to associate the subnet with this route table. We go to the virtual network and see all the subnets cannot be associated with this. Only the one that you have created, not which is, for example, Bayesian subnet. You cannot associate this with, right? Because it is managed service. Similarly, gateway subnet you cannot, but we can associate the subnets to whom we have deployed our workloads, and you have to control the traffic of those workloads. For example, this one for this particular virtual network. You click on OK, and now all those routes which are here will be applicable to all the workloads under this subnet, and these user defined routes will override all the system default routes. So this is what the user defined routing is, and this is what the system routing and traffic is, and that's how it works. I hope it was informative and you liked it. Thank you for watching, and you guys have a wonderful day. Bye bye.